This project is a retirement gift for a Chief Master Sergeant who's served in the Air Force for the past 29 years. I'm using black walnut and cherry for the frame, and the top is going to be made from a KC-135 aircraft window framed out in walnut. The inside of the table will be a shadow box. It'll have military memorabilia collected throughout the Chief's career. The Chief and I picked out all the wood for this project from a local gentleman who had bought a property on farmland that used to serve as a sawmill. The guy had several barns full of old wood, and since he had no other use for it, he was selling it for bargain prices. I really wish I had the footage of that trip. It was in the middle of August, the wood was in the loft of the barn, it was dusty and dark, and there were at least 1 million spiders in that place. Definitely an Indiana Jones-worthy experience. A lot of the wood had already been pilfered through by other buyers by the time we got to it, but we found some decent pieces. Still, they needed a lot of work to remove the warp, twist, cups, knots, and other defects. The planer did a pretty good job of this, but some of it was a little bit too twisted. So I worked on it with my hand planer a little bit, and then sent it through the machine. I went through the milling process using various methods. Some of the pieces I planed first, other ones I jointed. I used a couple different joiner sleds to get a straight edge. Once I had a piece flat on both faces and a straight edge on one side, I used the table saw fence to cut everything to final dimensions. After all my primary pieces were cut, I used painter's tape to label everything for glue up. I was very purposeful in the pieces I chose for each section. Because the tabletop was going to house an aircraft window, I wanted the wood grain to give a sense of movement and flow. What I ended up doing was cutting a straight edge through the light areas of several similar sapwood pieces, and then when mated together, the pieces gave off an airstream effect, which I used for the center of the tabletop. For the legs, I chose to use cherry with a strip of walnut in the middle. The striped look is simple yet elegant, and I think the clean lines gives a sense of military bearing. To set the window in the tabletop, I chose to route out a hole for it to sit in. I struggled for a while on the best way to go about this. When I originally drew up the plans for the design, I didn't have the window in front of me to get exact dimensions. When it arrived, it was much heavier and thicker than I anticipated, so instead of sitting the window in the tabletop, I decided to attach the window to the base of the table and set the tabletop over the window frame. To do this, I needed to route two separate shapes, an area to view the glass, and a 3/8 inch lip for the window to float under. This design allows the base to independently support the weight of the window, while also giving the top freedom of movement during seasonal climate changes. The next step was to sand as much as possible before I did the joinery. I started with 80 grit on a belt sander just to level out the glue ups. Then I worked up from there to a 150 on my random orbital sander. I needed this table to be robust, so I chose to use mortises with floating tenons for all the joints. I marked and labeled all the connecting pieces to a common face, then laid out the upper and lower limits for each mortise. I used a router jig to set my cups to the exact measurement of the common face, and the result gives a perfectly matched mortise on both sides of the connection. After all the mortises were complete, I trimmed out a piece of poplar until it was a perfect fit. Then I cut out all my floating tendons on a crosscut sled. I started the glue up process by attaching the legs to the long side of the base. Before I added any glue, I taped off all the joinery areas with painter's tape to make for easier cleanup. This also keeps my sanding to a minimum after the glue dries. Before I assembled the base fully, I attached the supports for the window. I used glue and countersunk screws with a piece of poplar to set the proper spacing for the sides of the window. Then I attached a piece of walnut for the window to rest on. This piece will be the only part visible through the glass, and it also creates a channel at each side of the window. I'll get to the purpose of that design a bit later in the video. Next, I glued up the short sides of the table. These spaces will also house drawers, but for the moment it's just a shell. Once the final piece is assembled, I can use the resulting dimensions to cut drawer faces and design the internals of the drawer. Before I connected the aprons, I routed out several holes near the upper inside faces. This is where I will use tabletop fasteners to secure the top to the base. The most important part of this particular process was to make sure the table was square. Once all the clamps were set up, I measured corner to corner and came up with equal measurements. The most critical tasks for this job were finished. Now that my base was complete, I started building the internals of the table. I used poplar and plywood to fabricate 3 boxes. 1 for the shadow box that would sit in the middle, and 2 that would be drawers on either side of the table. An important design feature of this box is that each drawer will also house a coin rack. The coin racks will face the shadow box almost like a football stadium, with the coins facing inward towards the center. The chief had requested that the coin rack be removable and face the box from the outside of the drawer without anything blocking the racks from the box. To accomplish this, I used a piece of 3/4 inch ply, which I churched up with edge banding. Once everything is assembled, this piece will serve as a drawer slide and common base for the drawer and coin rack to sit on. About this time in the project, I went out and bought a hand plane to help trim up the fine details. This was a game changer and made the process go much smoother. To make the coin racks, I used cherry trimmed in walnut. I took multiple passes on my table saw to cut 5 15-degree channels along the length of the cherry board. And then I routed out a rabbet and some walnut to be an end cap for the racks. I joined everything with a bit of glue and screws, which I then filled in with poplar dowels and trimmed flush with the surface. I completed the final sanding on the top before staining. During this time, I also filled a couple holes with CA glue and cut a small 45-degree bevel around the tabletop with my hand plane. Once everything was done, I hand sanded down to 220. I finished out the boxes with ebony stain and a few coats of wipe-on polyurethane that I mixed up myself. By this time the weather was below freezing outside, so I used an IR thermometer to check the temperature of all materials in the garage before I started applying the finish. Anytime the temperature gets lower than 40 in my workspace, I won't even attempt to apply any glue or finish. I had also ran out of gloves, and since the COVID crisis, I've had a hard time finding more. Now I just use Walmart bags. It works. I used a tung oil finish on the tabletop and base. I like the color the tung oil provides. It's kind of warm, and I think varnish blends tend to give some extra protection. The wood really soaked up the oil and made the grain pop nicely. After the finish dried, it was time to assemble everything. I started by mounting the custom drawer pulls to the drawer face. I didn't film making those, but they're basically a small version of the legs. I attached the coin racks to the drawer base and then set up for mounting the drawer. I used poker cards as shims to make sure everything was in alignment. It's funny how random objects become useful as shop tools. Then I used a modified corner clamp to hold the drawer face in place while I secured the pre-drilled screws. At the same time, my wife kindly offered to help me out by attaching the felt and foam board inside the shadow box. While she was inside doing that, I prepped a sign the chief had been gifted from his old squadron. Once the box was ready, I used it to help align and install the sign. Next, I cleaned up the aircraft window with glass cleaner and placed it in the side braces, then secured it with screws. I placed the tabletop over the window, made sure the alignment was good, and secured it with fasteners. It was a relief that all my measurements were good and everything fit together just like a glove. The last thing here was to install some LED lights. Remember that channel under the window base? That's what this area is for. This final detail really gives that wow factor I'm looking for. And with that, the project is complete. This project was really a pleasure to work on. I love creating furniture that's artistic and meaningful on a personal level. There were many challenges to overcome, and I learned a lot from the process. In the end, I hope this is a piece that the chief and his family can cherish for a lifetime.